Yeah.
And one of the things that struck me is that trauma really, it disconnects you. And so there's a sort of disconnection that happens between the mind and the body, between the past and the present, between you and the people around you, because it's very hard to have good relationships when you've been traumatized, because...
Yeah, don't be too categorical here. Huh? Like,
yes, tell me.
Because none of these things is 100% the case. Huh? Some traumatized people can have very deep friendships with people and be very devoted to their kids. And so there's many issues that happen, but they don't occur in everybody. Huh?
Yes. So this is what's fascinating. Yeah. They don't occur to everybody. And what I find fascinating is that sense that it's not in the event, it's in your reaction to the event.
Yeah.
And so what is it that determines how one person will react to a trauma in a completely different way to the other?
I wouldn't say that necessarily.
Okay.
People say, oh, this person wasn't affected by the trauma. How do you know? Just because they're able to keep a job and being pleasant dinner companion, how do you know that they don't do it? The only people who really know you are the people you're married to for some length of time. People may look great on the surface, but maybe it's hiding somewhere in their lives, and you don't get to see it. So I wouldn't automatically assume that people who are not obviously damaged are in fact not damaged.
And so do you think that a traumatic experience will damage everybody, but just in different ways?
It's never black and white. You know? And so, and then people have the identical experience. We don't have the identical experience. Because, like, let's say somebody maybe get killed in front of her face. That person may remind me of my best friend. They may not remind you of anybody. If that person reminds me of my best friend, it will have a deep impact to me. I may be with somebody who I trust, who puts his arms around me, and who makes me feel I'm safe now, even though it's a horrible thing. And you may be standing there by yourself, see the same event, but it won't be the same experience. So it's only superficial people who say, oh, people react to the same event in different ways. No, I want to know the precise details of what happened before I would say that.
That's, and what, so...
Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
I have an older brother who is very much into his body and was always a good athlete, and we had the same childhood experiences. I had asthma as a kid. If you have asthma, you have this very uncomfortable feeling in your body. And my brother always dealt with experiences very differently from the way I did, because I was an asthmatic kid. The external reality was pretty much the same, but the subjective experience was quite different.
And so what are the things that determine how you will react? One of the things you told me the other day, which I thought was fascinating, was that people on October the 7th who'd been taking psychedelics had less PTSD than people who were not on these psychedelics, for example.
Yeah.
And we know that the state that you're in when the trauma occurs really determines how you will react to the trauma. Yeah. And there, you give a great example in your book of a child who had burns, or children who had burns, who needed a lot less morphine when their mother was with them and they had secure attachment.
Yeah.
And so there are all these mitigating factors that really impact.
And the biggest mitigating factor is our attachment system.
Okay.
And that's something that psychiatry basically doesn't pay any attention to. And what we know is that we are deeply attached individuals, and that the core of meaning psychologically, but also physiological systems, is the security that we feel with the people we love. And so if you feel loved and connect with the people around you, you invariably have a very different reaction than if you're all by yourself and isolated and nobody's there for you. And so Oprah Winfrey and Bruce Perry wrote a lovely book called What Happened to You? Yes, what happened to you is important, but at least as important is who was there for you. And indeed, we found, when we study burn children, is kids who feel secure with their parents react very differently to horrendous burns than kids whose parents are absent, traumatized, alcoholic, workaholic, busy doctors, who are not. You don't really feel, my parents are here for me. So this factor of being there for each other is a critical factor that keeps getting lost in our systems, both educational and medical systems. The attachment system is so important. John Bowlby already showed that already in his movies about children who are left by themselves. Just the act of being abandoned has a very profound function. And what actually was discovered here is that the attachment system trumps the trauma system. So as long as you feel safely attached with your environment, you can put up with a lot of stuff. Darwin already pointed out, almost 200 years ago, he said, if you get traumatized and you get stuck in fight or flight, it interferes with your capacity to take care of your offspring, and your offspring becomes less resilient.
Less
resilient. And so that what really marks civilization is our capacity to care for each other.
So then it's particularly challenging if the person who's committing the trauma essentially is your attachment figure.
But absolutely.
Do you think that is the most damaging type of trauma? I mean, if you're...
I know.
Yeah.
But it is a factor that almost invariably is left out in talking about trauma. Who was there for you? And indeed, I really separated from much of the rest of our field when I brought in the whole issue of attachment. And really, my research shows, and other people's research also, that the trauma that occurs in the attachment system is the most damaging trauma that people have, and the most prevalent stuff. So people keep talking about, oh, trauma happens to soldiers. But the first study I ever did, myself, was that soldiers got traumatized because their best friend got killed, or their best friend was no longer for them. So even my very first piece of research shows that the relationship you had to the people around you who your life depended on was critically important, whether you got traumatized or not. And then this whole issue came up with child abuse, and then I became very active in testifying on behalf of kids molested by Catholic priests. And this is always an issue. Who were the kids who were being abused? Oftentimes, these abusive priests had a nose for family violence and for abuse in the family, and they would hit on these kids and seduce them and say, you're safe with me, I'll take care of you, and then they would molest them. But they almost, from all the kids who I saw, the adults, they seemed to target kids whose home life was not secure. And so they could play the role of a substitute parent, and then they would hit.
And that's so devastating. I mean, because essentially this figure that's supposed to be secure in your attachment figure then turns against you.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's also research that shows that if there's social support during a traumatic time, like, for instance, a natural disaster or a war, then it really mitigates the effects of the trauma, right?
Not only social, it has several factors. Whatever social support is, people tend to be very superficial about it. How close are you to the person? How much does this person mean to you? It doesn't get asked. Yeah. Do you have friends? Always very superficial. But not only that, the critical issue that also came up is whether you were able to do something. And so the issue of agency is terribly important. And by and large, as long as you can do something and move and activate those stress hormones that you secrete in order to cope, and if you can utilize them and become an ambulance driver or a medic or something to help people and to do something, that really mitigates against it also. And that physical immobilization and not being able to move and do something also is a major factor in it becoming traumatic. Yeah.
So if you're held down, or if you're a child and you can't run away, or if you don't have the agency,
Right.
then it's much more traumatic, essentially.
Yeah, and
if you're immobilized.
domestic violence, violence occurs between people, and sometimes people have violence in a relationship, and it's really nasty and unpleasant. But if you go like, hey, I'm out of here, you're probably going to be okay. But if you feel like you're physically or emotionally dependent, financially dependent on that person, or as happened in the United States and probably in the UK also, you couldn't have your own credit card without getting permission from your husband, then you're trapped. And our law is very much fed into being trapped. I just told you in the car that my mother came from quite a traumatic background, a lot of people do, and then she was very adaptive, became the vice president of an oil company at age 28, and she got married, and the Dutch law was if you have a job, you cannot, if you're married, you cannot have a job as a woman. So her coping mechanisms were just wiped out by social conditions.
Yeah, which is, yeah. So it's that being essentially immobilized. And you say after trauma, the world is experienced with a different nervous system. The survivor's energy now becomes focused on suppressing inner chaos at the expense of spontaneous involvement in their lives. How exactly, so first of all, we talk a lot about trauma, but there's this new sort of zeitgeist where people talk a lot about the nervous system and nervous system dysregulation. Would you equate trauma with nervous system dysregulation? What is the relationship between the two?
Yeah, the central nervous system is part of trauma. That is what gets affected.
Yeah.
And so there is this misconception, fostered by our definition of PTSD, that trauma is about an event. And most people think something happened to you. But yes, that is part of it, but that event actually is over. But your system has changed. And now you continue to see the world through the lens that you saw it through at that particular time. So in the long range, it's not that event anymore. It is that your system has changed that makes you live in a completely different world. And much of that work was actually, our work was very, really showed it very clearly, is that your whole perception of the world becomes different. And your reaction, like studied by my close friend Sandy McFarlane in Australia, showed that if you play a little sound in somebody's ears, somebody who has been traumatized has a different reaction to that sound than somebody who wasn't. It's a non-traumatic sound. And so your brain and mind organizes reality differently. And so the big challenge is, how do we help people to be fully alive and alert now, and that continue and change people's nervous system so they can grow into the stage that they're in their lives. It's very complicated.
Very, yeah. And then the body reacts to physiological and psychological stress in the same way, essentially. So my understanding is that the body doesn't recognize the difference between a physical stressor like a toxin, or if your mother smokes when she's pregnant with you, or if you're exposed to mold, or if you're exposed to an infection. It causes a sort of stress response, which is similar to if you have a psychological stressor.
Yeah. See, I don't really differentiate between those two, huh? Because your emotional brain reacts to illness in a particular way of helplessness. And again, if you're helpless and you have people around you who make you feel cared for, you can let go and know that things will be better. But if there's nobody there for you, I gave the example of my childhood asthma. It's a very lonely experience, so you interpret the world in a different way.
Yeah. But so your childhood asthma would have created a physical stress, but it was combined also with a psychological stress.
It's mainly a psychological stress.
Interesting.
It's terrifying, actually. Yeah,
and do you think the two, so I'm very interested in the link between the physical and the psychological.
You're so Western.
The what?
You're so Western. That's the illness of the West, that they separate those things.
Yeah, it's true.
At this point, I don't really do that so much anymore. Like,
But okay, but in the DSM-5, which your favorite book.
No, let's not talk shit here. Like.
So if we're reframing sort of mental disorders in terms of trauma and nervous system dysregulation, how would you rewrite the DSM?
No, I wouldn't. Let's not go there.
Just throw it away.
No, the thing is, so how do you help people to deal with this dysregulation? And the thing is, you need to activate their self-system. And first of all, you need to make it safe for them to feel what they feel. So when you're traumatized, you get signals from your body, I'm in danger. You say, I'm not in danger, let me drink, let me just go on a long run and not feel anything. And you try not to feel. And so the first order of business is to make it feel safe to feel what you feel. So one of my early-ish studies was to look at yoga for the treatment of PTSD. And my colleagues go, he has gone off the deep end. Putting your butt in the air, twisting your body into a pretzel for PTSD, because they had a mind-body split like you seem to still have. And they said, that's crazy. And they did a study where you help people to feel their bodies and to touch their toes, and people started to feel safe to feel their bodies. And they felt safe to feel their bodies. Their PTSD score started to improve to the point that I could sort of say, more or less, that yoga proved to be more effective than most psychiatric medications for trauma that we had studied up to that point. So helping people to feel safe in their bodies and to meet their bodies and to feel their emotions, their feelings and sensations is very important. And then the very important issue became the issue of touch, because touch is the greatest comfort that people can have. In the monkey literature, we talk about ventral-to-ventral contact. Putting your naked belly against another naked belly is, for most people, a great source of comfort and pleasure. If you have been raped and assaulted, that may be a terrifying experience. And so you are deprived of one of the great sources of joy, pleasure, and comfort in life. In psychiatry, we don't touch. And so learning to feel in your body that that it's safe to be touched is very important. That's not anywhere near the mainstream of what we do, and it takes a lot of very good training and very good body work to actually help people to feel their bodies and feel safe with human touch. And I know very few people who know how to do that well, but I know quite a few people who do. I can really help people with that.
And so if we're talking about ways of addressing trauma, and we throw out the DSM, and we basically
let's do that.
We basically...
Let's just talk about DSM. I was one of the people who contributed to the diagnosis originally, and we were very proud of ourselves that we had made this list of symptoms. But then when people reified this list of symptoms, John McCain or John Kerry, these two US senators whose names you may have heard, probably had the same PTSD score as the homeless person down in the street who lies there in a sleeping bag in the street. That is only a very small part of the whole larger picture. And these psychiatric diagnoses really don't tell us much about who this person is. It tells us a little bit about particular ways in which they're screwed up, but they don't tell us anything about that person. And you can be a damn genius and a fantastic doctor or whatever and have a terrible PTSD score, or you can be a homeless person. So there's all kind of other variables that are important.